Hello and welcome. Israel's offensive into Gaza has now entered a second stage. To get a sense of how long this ground offensive could go on for and what to expect from here, we're joined on India Today's News Track by Fareed Zakaria, the world's top foreign affairs guru. Fareed, welcome and thank you.
Pleasure to be here, Rahul.
The Israel Defense Force has gone into Gaza in a way which is quite different from what was initially imagined after the 7th of October. They thought that there'd be a big blitzkrieg. Instead, they've gone in some areas in a slow and deliberate fashion. Why do you think they've chosen to do what they have? And how do you see this ground offensive pan out from what we've seen so far?
I think you have to give President Biden a lot of credit for the way he has handled this. If you remember when it all began with the Hamas terror attack, President Biden was very strongly behind Israel, visited Israel, gained enormous credibility, I think, not just from the Israeli government, but from the Israeli people. That then allowed him to make his main pitch, which, if you remember, was slow down, think this through, ask yourself why and what you are doing, make sure that you have a plan for what happens as it goes on. And most importantly, he said, don't act in the heat of the moment. We did that after 9/11. We made mistakes. That was a very rare thing for an American president to say. And I think it allowed the whole Israeli system, because Biden is right now wildly popular in Israel, it allowed the whole Israeli system to almost sort of calm down for a minute. It almost gave them permission to think things through. And look, they're very smart people. And they began to realize, look, what do we gain by a massive ground assault? You're going to kill thousands and thousands of people. You're going to destroy the entire infrastructure. And will we really do better doing that? And what happens when we win? So now it seems to me that they have decided to do something a little bit more targeted. So they're going into particular areas. Presumably there are particular buildings and tunnels and military infrastructure they're going after. Don't get me wrong. They're still, Gaza it's a brutal strategy with a lot of collateral damage, but it's much, much less than would have happened.
It could also last for much longer.
It will probably last for much longer, so it's tougher on the Israelis. But I think doing something like this that is more targeted, more more specified, more narrow, is likely ultimately to be a better strategy. They still have the big challenge, Rahul, which is what happens when this all is done.
I'll come to that. Yeah. The mission objective right now is to destroy the Hamas. From what you understand, do you think they'll be able to achieve the objective of finishing the Hamas once and forever?
Look, I think they will be able to deal a very, very lethal blow to Hamas as an organization, as a military operating organization. They did it with Hezbollah, and they were able to. Now Hezbollah is different; it's in its own country, as it were, Lebanon. But they really managed to decimate it. They'll be able to do something similar with Hamas, but they will not be able to change the. They will not be able to destroy the idea of armed resistance, and that's
the part. They could make it worse, in fact.
Right. That's the part which I think fundamentally the Israelis are not thinking through properly, which is, the idea of armed resistance is being fed by the feeling that Palestinians have that nonviolent resistance has gotten them nowhere. The problem for the Israelis is, if you don't want armed resistance, you have to demonstrate that nonviolent resistance pays off. And the nonviolent resistance that the Palestinian Authority, in a sense, embodies, which is, we'll negotiate with you, we recognize you, we renounce terror, but it's gotten them nothing. They had promised their people a state on the West Bank. They haven't gotten it. They've gotten more checkpoints. They've gotten more military laws. They've even got more violence against them. The settlers have been engaging in random acts of violence. They rarely get arrested or prosecuted. So that's the dilemma. If you say nonviolent protest does not pay, you can understand how people will say, well, maybe violence is the only answer. And as you were implying, this kind of massive assault, Rumsfeld used to have this memo. He say, every day we should ask ourselves, are we killing more terrorists than we are generating with this action? That's a really interesting question to ask in Gaza.
So the initial question was that the Israeli Defense Forces will go in after a few weeks, occupy Gaza, and then the question would be what happens next. Now in this slow and deliberate response, the question changes to what happens in the interim while Gaza is being pounded and the IDF is coming in could take much longer. And secondly, to the point that you said in response to your first answer, who runs Gaza later? I spoke to former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. His sense was it could be an Arab coalition of sorts, an idea he tried to moot many decades ago which didn't work, but he thought it's now more doable than when he was Prime Minister. What's your sense?
I doubt it. Think about this. If you're the President of Egypt, you're the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, are you going to go on the back of Israeli tanks, as it were, after the Israelis have gone in and you know, in a sense, take over from the Israelis, work with the Israelis to set up a government in Gaza? And don't forget, whatever remnants there are of Hamas and Islamic Jihad are not going to be happy with that. They will launch an insurgency against you. The US tried to do this in Iraq. They brought in the UN to help govern Iraq. Immediately, the insurgency targeted the UN, and the that diplomat Sergio de Milo was killed in the bomb blast. So I don't think you're going to be able to find very easily an Arab force that's going to be willing to do this.
So what happens then to Gaza? Who runs it?
My gut is that Israel will face the brutal reality that either it will have to run it or it will have to withdraw, and it will...
But Israel can't possibly run Gaza, given that you have a hostile population. Even if the population comes down from 2 million plus, there's still lakhs of Gazans or Palestinian citizens.
Look, remember, they used to. I mean, Israel occupied Gaza from
and they had to come back.
1967. So, look, maybe I'm wrong, and they will be able to find some coalition of Arab forces that would be willing to do it. But really, those are the three options, right? There's one possibility is you get a bunch of Arab countries to do it. The second is Israel does it. The third is you just leave, and effectively some version of Hamas or something will come together. There is one other thought, which is the Palestinian Authority.
Which is very unpopular. Recent polls shows the Palestinian Authority being very unpopular in Gaza.
Yes. So none of these are optimal outcomes, but could you get the Palestinian Authority to come in again? Would they be willing to come in on the back of Israeli tanks and say we are benefiting from Israel having displaced Hamas? I doubt it. That's the whole problem here is anyone who is coming in, on the backs of Israeli tanks is going to be delegitimized in the eyes of the Gazans, not because they love Hamas, but because they don't like Israel, and they particularly despise what Israel is doing right now. There's this massive military incursion. So how can any force be seen as legitimate that in some ways working hand in glove with the Israeli forces? So if you agree that that's a fundamental problem, then you're left with these two options. Israel rules Gaza, or it leaves and some version of Hamas comes back.
How do you see the Hamas being able to fight back? From the 8th of October to now, to some extent, Hamas's military capacity has been degraded. Your best understanding of how much of their military capacity remains and their ability to hold the IDF back or damage the IDF as it comes in?
My sense is that there's been a lot of damage. The Israelis have dropped a stunning number of bombs in Gaza. I mean, bombs, rockets, whatever you call it. By some accounts, they have already dropped more bombs on Gaza than the US did in Iraq in the first year of the invasion. And, Iraq is a huge country. Gaza is, is a very, very small area. So my sense is there's a lot of damage to the infrastructure. A lot of the tunnels have been damaged. One of the reasons that the Israelis are blocking fuel to Gaza is because that very elaborate system of tunnels that Hamas has built, it's all underground, but it all requires air to be vented in, which is all done through power. And so once you don't have power, those tunnels can become death traps. So I think there's a scenario in which this is not going to be that easy But urban warfare generally, it generally helps the protector, the defender. They know the territory, the Israelis don't. They could have booby-trapped, landmine places. The Israelis don't need it. Interestingly, one of the reasons I think the Israelis did as much aerial bombardment as they did was they don't want to go apartment by apartment. They're just blowing down the entire building. So it's a much more brutal way of doing it. Whereas the United States, when it went into Iraq and helped the Iraqi army clear out cities, they would go apartment by apartment because it was very tough, very hard, very long. The Israelis have just knocked down the entire building.
In your view, did the Hamas think through second and third order consequences of their attack on the 7th of October? Now, there are two theories. One is that the terrorist organization is just so focused on making the terror attack itself a success that they haven't spent much time thinking through what comes next. The other is, given the scale and the precision of the attack, the Hamas would have naturally thought this through because these weren't terrorists planning the attack, they were military minds. Not just did they think through the attack itself, they also thought through their response. What's your view?
We're all guessing. It's a very good question that you're asking. My own general view about this is that people exaggerate the smarts of a lot of these terrorists. I mean, these are often, young, agitated, revolutionary types, hotheads. They're not great chess players. They're not sitting there, masterminding this. But I think it's fair to say that it would be crazy if they had not thought through the fact that the Israelis would respond. And of course, the Israelis would respond in a fairly big way. Did they believe it would be as dramatic as what you're seeing now? I doubt it. I think that the Israeli response has probably surprised them just in terms of the size and scale of the aerial bombardment, the way in which they've mobilized. I mean, they've mobilized 400, 500,000. If you take the army plus the reserves, you've got a huge Israeli army there. So I don't know that they had thought through what do we do if you have, thousands and thousands of bombs dropped on Gaza? What do we do if half the population has been evacuated out of northern Gaza? That's what they are facing now is probably the most significant military operation against a Palestinian group, since 1948,
One of the big questions still is about whether this conflict escalates into a regional war, whether the Hezbollah gets involved, whether Syria gets involved. There have been some limited attacks, skirmishes on both sides. American assets also at least attempted to be targeted. Do you see this escalate, or do you think as the war wears on, the chances of escalation are coming down?
I tend to think that the escalation is more likely to happen depending on what Israel does rather than the other way around. Because at the center of the question of escalation from the north is the issue of Iran. Hezbollah is an arm of Iran. Hamas has ties with Iran. I think sometimes people exaggerate them. There's no question that the Iranians give Hamas funding, but it's a more complicated relationship. For example, over Syria, Hamas and Iran broke because Iran was supporting Assad, and Hamas, being a radical Sunni fundamentalist organization, was actually supporting the Sunni jihadists who were fighting President Assad in Syria. So there are differences, but Hezbollah is basically an arm of Iran. My sense of Iranian strategy is that they have always been a little bit more under the radar. If you look at how Iran exerts influence in the Middle East, they don't go around, invading countries. What they do is they've developed political groups and militias in Iraq. They develop political group and militia in Lebanon, Hezbollah. They support the Houthis in Yemen. They support the government of Assad. These are all essentially non-Sunni groups, right? The Alawites, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, the Shia. That's their mechanism. They're more kind of slow, organic, steady, infiltrating. It would be very uncharacteristic of them to go for a blitzkrieg where they launch, people keep saying Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets and they'll launch them all at Israel. It may do. Look, I may be wrong, but that would be certainly a break from the history. So my own sense is that the Iranians are watching. They're trying to see, what is the way they can, at low cost, gain maximum advantage here? And can they tie Israel down? Can they do more? Because if you notice, the strikes from the north now are pinpricks. They're designed to distract Israel, to give it a little trouble, no more than that.
But that could have an escalatory spiral of its own at any time.
Because if the Israelis feel, jittery, and they feel like they need to eliminate that potential threat, and there's a massive Israeli strike on Hezbollah rocket launchers, could the Hezbollah then respond in kind? Yes, absolutely. But what I'm saying is a lot will depend on how Israel handles this. And I think that Israel will see the wisdom on, better to handle the one-front war than to try to deal with the two-front war.
Opinion seems divided at the moment on the role that Iran played in this Hamas attack. The Wall Street Journal has been reporting that a lot of these Hamas terrorists actually trained in Iran before this. American intel seems to be trying very hard to debunk that, saying the Iranians were caught off guard. They obviously don't want that it be accepted globally that Iran was involved. What's your sense of what Iran actually knew about the attack and whether these terrorists were trained in and by Iran?
As I say, Iran's relationship with Hamas is more complicated than with the Hezbollah. They have definitely funded it. They have helped coordinate some level of activity between Hezbollah and Hamas. But the people I've talked to in the intelligence community in the US do not believe that Iran directs Hamas. Iran has that kind of direct level of control. And I don't, the two don't have identical objectives. So it's difficult to tell. They certainly benefit. Iran benefits from Hamas, destabilizing the things, particularly, the one reason I do think that Iran is happy about this, even if it didn't plan it, and I don't have direct knowledge one way or the other, is that the principal geopolitical effect of this Hamas attack and the Israeli counterattack has been to delay, and perhaps delay for a while, the Saudi-Israeli rapprochement. So if you think about it in those terms, who benefits? The greatest benefit has been that alliance between the Gulf Arabs and Israel, that was on its way to becoming almost a formal alliance, has been severely damaged.
But that just seems to be temporary. At some point in time, we've seen enough now from Saudi Arabia as well to suggest that once this is done with, they want to stay on that path. It's not dead and buried as was initially imagined soon after the attack.
Yeah, that's probably true. Look, the underlying strategic reality that created this situation is the following. It all starts with the Iraq War. In the Iraq War, what the United States does is it dislodges the Sunni government in Iraq, Saddam Hussein's government, and empowers a democratic government. But in the Middle East, people don't think in terms of democracy and not. What democratic government in Iraq means a Shia government in Iraq, because it's a Shia majority country. So what happens there is you have now disrupted the fundamental strategic balance of the Middle East, which was between the Shias and the Sunnis, between the Persians and the Arabs. Suddenly, Iran has access and influence, substantial access and influence, to this powerful Arab, previously Sunni state. This scares the Saudis, the Emiratis, who start thinking to themselves, Iran's influence is growing. In the Yemen situation, it becomes even stronger. So now they start to say to themselves, we need to band together and we need to find common cause with Israel, which is the other great anti-Iranian power in the region. And what had previously been the big obstacle to that normalization, the Palestinian issue, they decide, the threat is too great. Screw the Palestinians. We're going to go ahead and do this. So that's the logic, and you're exactly right. That logic still applies. But what they are realizing, I think, is that the governments may think, screw the Palestinians. The people don't think that. And so all of a sudden, they're now on the back foot because they've realized that, they're beyond a point they cannot really screw the Palestinians. They can't ignore the issue. They will have to resolve that. They will not be able to just go back to, a year from now, the violence has died down, and they'll say, oh, the Israelis will have to make some significant compromises on the Palestinian issue. This is, by the way, what the Biden administration was urging the Israelis to do anyway. Question is, will this government in Israel be willing to make any concessions on the Palestinian issue?
Do you think the attack and what's following after that makes the possibility of a two-state solution more real? It was kind of dying and being buried by the Netanyahu government. Do you think now that it's more alive in the global conscience, it just makes it imperative that there be some kind of ceasefire at some time and there be some kind of resolution?
Look, it'll take a while because I think people need to understand, particularly outside Israel, this really was Israel's 9/11. It's probably even more dramatic in a sense because, in percentage of the population, it's like 30,000 Americans dying. Israel also has these memories of the Holocaust and things like that. So this is a very charged moment in Israel. They want revenge and they want to show the Palestinians, Hamas in particular, you can never do this to us again. But when that dies down, I do think it has made everybody in the world, and I think including Israel, realize you can't just sweep this under the rug. There are 5.5 million Palestinians living in territory controlled by Israel. You've got to do something with them. And in a sense, it's very simple. Either they have to get political rights within Israel, or they have to have some political entity of their own that they regard as adequate, which is a state of some kind. If you do neither, you have a situation which is not going to be, it's not going to be manageable. It's not going to stay quiet. And so I think you're right that in some senses, what this will do is to make people realize that problem of 5.5 million Palestinians has to be solved.
Israel now has a wartime cabinet. Some of the more radical elements have been left on the side just for the time being. What does this war mean for the politics of Benjamin Netanyahu? Is Bibi's political career over in your view?
People have said that about him for a long time. He's one of the shrewdest politicians I've ever met. He's very, very canny. He's also pretty opportunistic, by which I mean he will ally with whoever it takes to stay in power. So I would never rule him out, but I think it's looking tough. It's looking hard because he has been discredited. A lot of people on the right and the left feel like he was pursuing the wrong strategy. And, this is one of the things that when a politician does something that undermines his own image of himself, that's the worst. Because Bibi always said he was Mr. Security, Mr. National Security, the tough guy. Well, the tough guy is the guy who seemed to be asleep at the switch when you had this massive attack. So it's going to be tough for him, but don't make a mistake of thinking that means you'll get a more left-wing government in Israel. I mean, if you get Bibi Netanyahu discredited, that might actually move you to another Likud leader, or it could even mean an even more right-wing government. The left in Israel, the fundamental dynamic that has taken place, and this is where Palestinians, I think, really do, one has to place a lot of the blame on them. When Arafat turns down the Camp David agreement that Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton put together, Arafat turns that down and launches an intifada. That destroyed the Israeli left for a generation. That was 2000. We're in 2023. Basically, the left has been out of power in any meaningful sense all that time. And it was because of that. It was because of that feeling that even when we tried to give them a state, they didn't, they didn't accept it. Now, there are many good Palestinian accounts of what the nature of that proposal was. It wasn't a proper state. It wasn't a full state. But I think the political effect, nevertheless, was to destroy the Israeli left. I don't think this attack will help revive the Israeli left. And that's the fundamental problem. The Israeli left is willing to work toward a Palestinian state. This new Israeli right is fundamentally unwilling. And it has no answer to this problem. What do you do with 5.5 million Palestinians? They seem to think they can just, kind of keep them in this servile condition forever. But I think they're wrong.
Campuses globally have seen massive protest. Professors, deans, students very agitated. How are you seeing this play out? Because a lot of the woke, liberal, young blood seems to actually be weighing in on the side of the Palestinians, and the capitalist, older professors are just appalled by what these young students are saying. They're telling parents, "Apne bachcho ko dekho kya kar rahe."
It's not even just the professors, it's really the trustees and the donors. I think I'm an old-fashioned classical liberal. I believe in free speech. I think people who want to be pro-Palestinian on campus should be heard. People who want to be pro-Israel should be heard. I don't think, in my view, it's a bad idea to chill that kind of speech. And it's been a little sad to see that at the end of the day, even in a place like America, so dedicated to free speech for too many people ends with the things you really don't like to hear. But the whole nature of free speech is you're protecting free speech not for just the speech you agree with, but it's the speech you violently disagree with. It's the speech that, is almost makes you, sets your hair on fire. That should be the way universities handle it. The University of Chicago, to give them credit, is the one place that has gotten it right. The university said, we are taking no position on this issue, as we have never taken a position on anything. We did not take a position after 9/11. We did not take a position after Black Lives Matter. Our position is we believe in freedom of expression, inquiry, academic research, and in order to allow that to be fostered, we as an institution have to take no position so that all our students and our faculty can feel they can take whatever positions they want. That is the appropriate position for a university. But what happened is really, this all dates back to the George Floyd murder. And obviously a horrible thing. Universities decided that they wanted to be woke. And so they all clambered on and they made statements denouncing it. Now, if you make a statement denouncing one thing, then when the Hamas attack happened, people started saying, well, why are you not denouncing that? So then they denounced that. Then the Palestinians said, now why are you not denouncing the Israeli strikes on Gaza? They've gotten themselves into a crazy situation. They will regret having tried to jump onto this woke bandwagon. They should have followed Chicago's example.
Because now you've got activist investors saying, give us a list of all those students on campus who supported the Palestinian cause. We'll ensure our companies and the ones that we control don't hire these guys. And that's quite...
It has a chilling effect on free speech. Obviously, they're private employers. They should be able to employ whomever they want. Is that the best use of your leadership to, again, I say, these people are not committing acts of terror themselves. They're making an argument, which I disagree with, that, what Hamas did was some kind of legitimate armed resistance. But people forget, on American campuses during the 70s, there were people who openly spoke in favor of the North Vietnamese, openly spoke in favor of Pol Pot in Cambodia, openly spoke in favor of all kinds of radical Maoist guerrilla movements. In India, people spoke in favor of the Naxalites. That's what a free society is.
Things have changed, though, from there, where it's becoming less and less permissible to say these things. Now, a lot hinges on the American elections, and I want your sense of how you see things shape up from where we're at. Are we almost inevitably heading towards a Trump versus Biden face-off again?
It looks like that. Look, Biden is, it's his choice. And if he decides that he's going to run, and he seems to have decided, no one in the Democratic Party will challenge him. Look, he's been a very successful Democratic president. He has passed more important legislation than any Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson. Popularity is low, but I think we're in an age of this partisan warfare where nobody's popularity really gets above 45% or so. He's, I think, 39-40% right now. Trump was in the same range. The reality is, when you become president of the United States right now, 40% of the country hates you, just to start with, because what party you come from. Maybe 45% hates you. So your room to maneuver is very, very limited. People forget now, after 9/11, Bush George Bush's popularity went to like 78 or 85% or something. Bush Sr.'s popularity after the first Iraq War was at 91%. These numbers are history. They'll never see them, at least not in the foreseeable future. Deeply divided partisan country. But if Biden decides to run, no Democrat will deny him the nomination.
Who might win a Trump versus Biden face-off?
Right now, honestly, it is looking pretty dead even. My own gut is at the end of the day, Biden will probably win that because I believe that there is a small working majority in the U.S. that does not want to vote for Trump. They're not enthusiastic about Biden, but they don't want to vote for Trump. And I say this on the basis, if you look at, there have been many elections, in state elections, the House of Representatives, midterm elections. In all of them, the Trump-oriented candidates have done worse than people expected. So there is some pushback against Trump. But look, it's very close. If Biden has a serious health issue and stays on the ticket and insists on running, if the economy goes into the tank and does badly, could it change? Yeah, it's very scary that we are that. And remember, this is not a national election. Biden will win by probably close to 10 million votes overall. But because of the weird electoral college system, this election for the most powerful man in the world is going to be decided in 4 states in America, probably Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. And in those states, the cities are all going to go Democratic, the rural areas are all going to go Republican, and it's going to be this sliver of voters in what we call the exurbs, the places around the cities, probably 100,000 voters, mostly working age women, are going to decide the fate of the war in Iraq, the war in Ukraine, what happens in China, Taiwan, the future of the international system. It's really breathtaking when you think about how small a number of people are going to have an impact on this vast issue.
Fascinating. You spoke of leaders and their plummeting popularity ratings, not just in the US but globally. What then, according to you, from an international prism, explains Prime Minister Modi's consistently high ratings? Like Morning Consult puts him at 70% plus, and there's no war. It's, he's 9 years into his second prime ministership, and yet his ratings are higher than any leader anywhere in the world.
I think Narendra Modi has found a way to connect with the ordinary Hindu voter in India in a way that almost nobody, I think, has been able to do it. And he's found a way to connect with a particular rising aspiration of Indians who felt that they were not left behind, but their time had not yet come. This is not necessarily the urban, educated, elite voter. This is the guy in the second or third tier city who maybe has some education but not a college education, but is now moving up. And that sense of pride that person has in this upward movement, Modi has been able to speak to and to capture very powerfully. It's worth noting the limits, though, which is the BJP and Modi does not have much purchase in the South. He obviously does not have much purchase with the 200 million Indian Muslims, or with Christians, or with other minorities. But with the bulk of the Indian voter, and with that core that I'm describing, he has been able to very powerfully represent their aspirations, their sense of progress, their sense of pride in themselves, which is it's a very admirable thing. I would hope that he would use that to build a more inclusive India. But you cannot deny the achievement, which is an extraordinary political achievement.
Without getting into the nuances of national politics, from an international prism, your sense of his re-election chances, because the likes of Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, very important political characters in their country, had a very tough time 10 years on in their third election. How do you see, from an international perspective, Prime Minister Modi's re-election chances?
Yeah, there's some good studies that show that after 10 years it becomes very hard. Just because in democracies voters get tired of you. I don't see that right now with Modi. He still seems very vital and vibrant. It's possible, I think, that you could imagine. I think the BJP will do worse than it did in the last election. somebody defeating him, I think you'd need the entire opposition to come together. You'd need them to come together in a cohesive way so that there was always a one-to-one BJP versus the coalition rather than, one Congress candidate, one DMK candidate, one whatever. So far the opposition does not seem to have that unity of purpose. And then the question is, do you also need to have an alternative charismatic leader who can be a contester? I don't know that. Certainly in the 90s, India had many, shall we call them not particularly charismatic people like Narasimha Rao, Deva Gowda. But certainly you need an opposition that is strategically unified in a very disciplined way. I don't see that right now.
President Biden and Xi Jinping haven't met since the G20 Bali summit. It's quite likely that in November there will be a meeting in San Francisco. How do you see America-China ties shape up from here? Are both Beijing and DC trying to dial back on the hostilities?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think what's happened is both sides, for their own reasons, needed to flex muscles and to demonstrate that this was going to be a difficult and competitive relationship. The U.S. had to do certain things, like the chip ban, which, in my opinion, were the right things to do. But of course, they were going to annoy the hell out of the Chinese, and that created a certain amount of friction. But now what you're getting to is the question, which is really a fundamental question. Are we on an endless trajectory, a downward spiral, downward ratcheting, tit for tat going, or can we establish some strategic equilibrium between the two most powerful countries in the world? And I think both recognize that there is a value to reaching some strategic equilibrium so that you don't have this feeling like it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, and that may then end up leading to war. So I think we are now testing that idea. Can you find a resting place? Can you find a place where you have a good working relationship within an admittedly competitive relationship where there's going to necessarily be some degree of tension as events in China's military buildup will continue, its nuclear buildup will continue. America's support for Taiwan is not going to stop. So that's the challenge. I think that you're probably going to see some significant efforts to achieve that kind of equilibrium.
Not much emerges from behind the Great Wall of China in terms of information, but we've seen almost half the cabinet now being rearranged. What is your best sense of what's going on?
So what I have heard is that Xi Jinping, that this all actually dates to the Ukraine war. Xi Jinping asked his people, what explains why the Russian military has done so badly in the Ukraine war? Why have they performed much worse than expected? Russia is 15 times the size of Ukraine in terms of its GDP, 3 or 4 times the defense budget, 4 times the population, I think. And the response he got back was the Russian military is much weaker than people realized. That on paper it looked good, but it's very corrupt, very dysfunctional, and that the corruption had sapped the effectiveness of the forces. So he began to look into his own forces and discovered that for example, in the space program, which is the rockets program, there was a massive amount of corruption. So you notice he fired the 2 generals who were in charge of that program. Then he realized that the oversight of the entire defense process was corrupt, and so he fired the defense minister. I think the foreign minister was a slightly different issue, which was he was having an affair with somebody who was, they thought, right, and may have had some ties with, who knows? There's some people who feel that she might have been a Western spy. But that's the best understanding I have, and it's consistent with Xi's long-time effort to crack down on corruption. But as you say, it's the strangest thing because it's a black box. They never explain anything. There is no Chinese media to speak of. So we're all reading tea leaves. We used to say that we're reading tea leaves about the Kremlin, but the Russians don't really drink coffee. They don't drink tea. But in the Chinese case, it's an appropriate metaphor because we are reading Chinese tea leaves.
And speaking of Russia, and before I end, how do you see the Ukraine-Russia war go from here, given the fact that America and even in Europe, so much attention now focused on Israel and Hamas? How might this impact Ukraine being able to hold back or push back against Russia?
Look, the fundamental thing people, particularly I think in a place like India, need to understand is the Ukrainians are not going to surrender. This is their country, this is their independence, this is an existential struggle for them. For them, this is a struggle of a colonial empire, Russia, that is trying to hold on to its last prized colony. It's like the French in Algeria. The French killed 1 million people in Algeria over 15 years. The Algerians didn't give up. Ultimately, the Ukrainians, I don't think, are going to give up. And so the question is how much blood is spent, how many people are going to die in this process. But I don't think the Ukrainians are going to give up. And as long as they have substantial Western support, I think they will be able to hold the Russians at bay. Will they be able to conquer back all their territory? I think that's a tough one. But they are making inroads in the south. They're even making attacks on Crimea. They just assassinated the guy who the Russians had picked to lead the Ukraine after, when the Russians thought they were going to conquer it. So I think they're making some progress, but it's going to be a slog. Much more likely at some point these lines will harden around certain areas. Maybe, I hope the Ukrainians are able to take more in the south, because Ukraine's real objective is it needs to be able to have Odessa, its port in the Black Sea, be a place where it can export out of. If you cannot export out of Odessa, Ukraine is not viable economically. Most people don't realize goods, when you ship them by sea, the shipping costs are 10% of the cost on rail. So Ukraine cannot, it's the breadbasket of the world. It has to be able to export its grain through Odessa. If it's doing it through rail, it's a disaster for them. It's much more expensive. So they need to get back some of those territories in the south.
Is the West reaching a zone where they don't feel as compelled to support Ukraine militarily as they have been? And if, God forbid, Donald Trump wins in the US, then America's support would diminish substantially.
Look, I think that the West has not, if anything, you notice very consistent support. There are some people in the Republican Party. That's really the only place you're seeing this, other than a few small countries in Europe like Hungary. There is, within the Republican Party, a new isolationism. And it's very troubling, and by the way, it's something that should worry Indians as well, because it's really a kind of withdrawal from the world. Trump wants to come in and put tariff barriers on everything, on all goods. He has indicated in some ways that he wants to pull out of NATO or withdraw. What it would mean was a fortress America. And the Americans, can do that because the US economy is vast. America is not that dependent on trade. 80% of the US economy is a domestic economy. So it would be a seismic change to the international system, and would result in a lot of closing down. I hope it doesn't happen, but it's a distinct possibility. But as long as the West provides, and even if America stopped, Europe kept going, I still think the Ukrainians would keep at it. That's where I think, the part we all need to understand is these people are fighting for their existence as a nation. They're not going to stop. And in Russia is paying a huge price in its long-term future. In the short term, it can sell oil. It has enough money to keep this going. It has a huge military-industrial complex. But in the long run, what Russia has done is it has mortgaged its future. It is no longer going to be a technology power. It is no longer all the smartest young Russians have left. In a sense, what you're left with is a kind of rump military-industrial dictatorship that is ruling over this country. And it's a very sad future for the Russians. They will be able to survive. Putin will be able to survive. But it will be a kind of hollow shell of what Russia could have been, which is a really great country. And all because it wants to hold on to its last colony.
This has been a fascinating masterclass, so much insight. It's like being in college and listening to your professors speak, and so much to learn and take away from this interaction. Thank you very much, Fareed Zakaria, as always. Thank you.
Rahul, always a pleasure.
Thank you so much.